Lunch and Learn is particularly about solar energy on your preserve farm in New Jersey. So we're happy to have here today our presenters, Chuck Roohr with the New Jersey Department of Agriculture, and also Justin Bryan, Program Manager with EnSave, that third-party technical consultant. So I'm just going to go right ahead and turn the presentation over to Chuck.
Okay, so I'm Chuck, as Laura said, and I work for the State Ag Development Committee, which is more commonly known as the Farmland Preservation Office for New Jersey. And I help run the section of the office that handles all the requests and activities that occur on preserve farms after they're preserved. So everybody knows about the section of the office that actually goes out and processes applications and helps preserve the farms. But then there's a whole lot of things that happen with now 2,900 farms after they're preserved, and my side of the office helps review, process, work with landowners to get those things to happen for them. And one of the more popular things is the solar program. So solar, I believe it was 2010 when legislation was passed that allowed two things to happen. One was for solar and other renewable energy systems to exist on preserved land, and the other was that it created right to farm protection, or added right to farm protection to for solar and renewable energy systems. So we're just briefly going to touch on the right to farm piece of it. So the Right to Farm Act was created when the Farmland Preservation Program was created in the early 80s. And the act itself was designed to allow farmers some protection from, it's probably not the right legal word, but overbearing or overzealous township ordinances and/or neighbor complaints for basically conducting normal, traditional, typical agricultural production activities. So you could understand that in a state like New Jersey, where every farm has neighbors, and not every farm is located in a super rural area. So sometimes townships create ordinances or impose ordinances that were designed for more residential landowners on farms, and other times residential neighbors who may have moved in when it was wintertime and the farm was very quiet and peaceful and scenic. And then spring and summer comes around, and tractors are driving around early, manure is being spread, dust is being created. They sometimes have some complaints. So the Right to Farm Act was generally meant to protect farmers who are doing normal ag activities from these sort of nuisance type complaints. There are some requirements to be eligible for the Right to Farm Act protections. One is that either the farm be 5 acres or more and producing at least $2,500 in production income a year, or if it's less than 5 acres, that they're producing $50,000 or more per year. And another sort of nuanced requirement is that the farm would have had to have been in existence at the time that the Right to Farm Act was created, which is sometime in the 80s. In most cases, all the farms have, in almost all cases, farms existed previously, so that one's not hugely necessary. We go to the next slide. So for solar, like I said, in the 2010s, when the solar legislation was created, it also created the Right to Farm allowance that solar would be protected. Back then, it was more a situation of towns imposing more residential requirements on farm solar, and so there was some pushback. But that has since subsided a little bit. One of the key factors of the legislation is for solar on preserve farms is that it allows for the farms to produce essentially their own energy demand, not the giant grid-sized systems that take up 25 acres to send back to the grid. So I think once the towns caught on to that, and these are more smaller scale systems, a lot of the pushback went away. But regardless, the the right to farm ag management practice for solar does exist, and you can use it two ways. One is if you are if you've been approached by a town who doesn't want to approve your solar system, or if you've got a neighbor who's upset with how the system is affecting them or perceives to be affecting them. Right to farm can offer you protection that way. But another way to use it is in a preemptive sense, meaning a lot of folks call us after the town has lodged a complaint or after the neighbor has lodged a complaint. But you could use the AMP in a preemptive manner if you have the expectation that either your town or a cranky neighbor who always complains about your operation, if you expect that complaint to be lodged, you could use the right to farm AMP preemptively, meaning if you follow the AMP lists certain ways that you would construct your system, setbacks and screening, things like that, that are what the state has determined to sort of be more good neighbor policy. And if you decide to use those standards and build your system in that way in the beginning, if after you've built it, a neighbor or a town lodges a complaint, basically that complaint goes to your county ag development board, which is the county level farmland preservation office. They would evaluate it. If it's determined that you have in fact built your system per the standards of the AMP, you basically have blanket protection. So so that's a preemptive way that you could do it if you thought that you were going to run into some hurdles with your town or a neighbor. If you don't think that's going to be an issue, it is not a requirement that you build your system per the AMP. It's just some good neighbor tips and standards that would give you either protection after the fact if you can alter your system to meet those requirements, or ahead of time if you build it that way in the beginning. Can we go to the next slide? So the application requirements, and this is the application requirements if you're a preserved farm, has nothing to do with whether you're seeking right to farm protection or not. This is just you are a preserved farm and you're looking to do solar on your property. What are the application requirements? So 9 out of 10 times the application is actually downloaded from our website. The landowner gives it to their installer and says, hey, this is part of the package, you fill out this application. The reason for that is, although the process is not super complicated, the application does ask a lot of technical questions. I like to think of it as these are the forms and fact sheets and technical data that your installer probably carries around with them in their briefcase or in the passenger seat of their car with them, and they probably know it right off the cuff. But me looking at these, or a typical homeowner probably doesn't know the actual specifications on how big a panel is, or how many kilowatts each panel generates, et cetera, or how the mounting system has been spec'd out. So like I said, those are the kind of technical questions that are asked. Certainly a landowner could fill it out, but most of the time it's just easier if the installer fills it out. So a couple of the big things that are asked for, and that a landowner would know probably even better than their installer, would be, what is the system going to be used for? Actually, what is it going to power on your farm, whether it's your house or your barns or who knows what, or maybe it's everything. And then also one of the things that's required is to provide your last 12 months energy bills or electric bills. So usually those are needed for other purposes in the installation process. And so the installer probably has them, but definitely that's something that they were going to get from the landowner. So that's it on that one. The application, the link for it is here. It is on the SADC's website. It's here in this PowerPoint, but also my contact information, and also the fellows in my office who would process these applications, their contact information is there too. So if you need an application or you just have a question on an application, you can feel free to give any of us a ring. So Once we get the application, this is the process. So all applications for solar are submitted to the SADC, so to my office, regardless of what entity preserved your farm. The legislation says that the SADC gets the application, reviews it, and has to deem it complete, meaning it meets all the criteria. Well, it has all the documents that are asked for, and it meets the regulatory compliance. Once the SADC deems the application complete, we will then forward the complete application to the primary easement holder, which 90% of the time is the local county office. So, if you're in Hunterdon County or Morris County or Burlington County, it's your local CADB office that we would send it to. The CADB office doesn't have review and approval authority. They just have a comment ability. So we're sending it to them. Typically, they put it on their monthly meeting, and then their board looks at it, and their board administrator will send us whatever comments they have. I will say in the 10 plus years that we have been receiving applications, we've only gotten positive comments. So the purpose is, one, to let the local easement holder know that an application for solar has been received, and two, if there's something about the property specific or something that's happened recently that the local office would know better than the state office, well, we want that to let us know, particularly if there's some kind of problem that solar would be an issue if it was put up. So we send it to them, but like I said, we've never gotten negative comments, so that's a good thing, but it is part of the process. And then overall, the SADC has 90 days once we've deemed the application complete. We have a 90-day timeline to get it all done. Typically, it doesn't take the 90 days. Once we get the comments back, we typically put it on our next month's agenda. So if we can work that timing out where the county meets early in the month, we always meet the fourth Thursday of every month. So if the county meets early and we meet later in the month, it could be just a 4-week process. But the 90 days is built in there. There are a couple times of the year, August, we normally don't have a meeting. And then as you get towards the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, sometimes our schedule gets adjusted, and it might take a little bit longer. But at any rate, there was also a provision that was done a couple years ago to allow roof mount systems that don't have any impact on the soil to be administratively approved. So that means we don't have to wait for the monthly meeting. We can have our executive director approve those systems in-house. So we do still have to wait for the county comments, but like I said, typically those happen pretty quickly, and then in a few days after that, we can have our executive director sign off on these. So these would be a roof-mounted system. Say it's going on your house or your barn, and everything is contained. There's a meter either on the barn or on the house that you're connecting to, and you don't have to. There's no impact to the farm ground itself. If that's the kind of system that you have, then we can do this administrative process and get them done even faster. The SADC meeting, where if it does have to go to an SADC meeting, the meetings are public and the vote happens right there, right in front of you. You could either be there in person, or we do, ever since COVID, we have them. We have the ability to view the meetings online. So you see what happens in live. You see what happens live, and you get your answer that day. And the landowner, a couple days after the meeting, will get a letter that says the action that the committee took, and as well as a copy of the resolution that shows that it was approved. In some cases, townships ask for that. In other cases, they do not. But that's the process. I would say the thing that holds the process up the most is incomplete applications. So the legislation requires that we ask for and get certain documents, and we don't have much leeway in not asking them. So sometimes people have submitted applications and said, well, I can't find my 12 months utility bills. But trust me, I wouldn't build a system bigger than what I need. And although I tend to believe that, unfortunately, the legislation requires that we have that in our file. So it's one of those paperwork things. So once we get a complete application, the process is usually pretty smooth. Next slide. Oh, so yeah, kind of what I was getting at. There are some key provisions in the legislation. I guess one of the smaller ones is the 12 months utility bills, but some of the bigger ones, that the system can't significantly interfere with the ability to use the land for farming. So it's farmland preservation. The intent of preserving the land was for farming purposes. I would say most farmers that I know who are making their income from farming never have a problem with this because they don't want the system in their way. But there are some landowners who are not farming for a living, and they may want it in a location that's more aesthetically pleasing. I can say we are very much aware that a solar unit needs to go in an area that's, of course, sunny. So we're not going to make you, put it in the woods just because it's out of the way. But if you have a 20-acre vegetable field and you say, well, I want to put it right in the middle of it, we would probably, that would raise a red flag for us. So either we would ask you to move it to a spot that's more out of the way, or ask for you to tell us why it has to be in that location. Probably the biggest wrinkle that we get when we get solar applications is this second one, number 2, that the system must be owned by the farm owner within a period of 20 years. So you can lease it for 19 years and 364 days, as long as you own it on the end of the lease. You can buy it up front. You can do a lease to buy option, but at the end of 20 years, the system has to become the property of the landowner. This is our most common issue because there's so many different ways that you could get solar. Some don't, it's a lease with no option to buy, or it's a purchase after 20 years. And unfortunately, it is one of those statutory things that we don't have the ability to alter. So it is a requirement, and maybe that was in the 2010 when the law was created. Maybe that was typical, and things have just gotten more creative since then. But unfortunately, the law hasn't changed, so it's what we're stuck with. So I would just keep that in mind for anybody who's looking to do solar. Just that's the biggest provision that causes hiccups for us. And the last one, the unit must provide power or heat to reduce the farm's energy demand. So basically powering your farm, reducing your energy need, and not servicing an off-farm use or a non-farm use on the farm. We do have some situations where you have perhaps an exception area and there's a non-farm business occurring there. You could have put solar on your preserved farm and connect it to your neighbor's farm, or you couldn't connect it to your you're renting your exception area to a welding business. You couldn't connect it to that non-farm use as well. So that's the intent there. Next slide. Yep. Okay, so we don't see this one as much of a problem anymore, but in the beginning it was that a non-permanent mounting system be used. So what that really boils down to is no concrete. When the first few that came in, they did come in, people were using a standard, for ground-mounted systems, a standard metal pipe, and they were pouring concrete footing around it. So the law says that non-permanent mounting systems have to be used unless an engineer says that a permanent mounting system is necessary. What we see most of the time now is the helical screw-in piles. And so you hook that to a skid steer and it kind of, drills it in like a post hole digger. Those are totally fine. So no concrete, and we're finding most installers are using that system. It seems to be efficient, just as structurally sound, and faster to put in. The only time that we had a permanent unit that required concrete for the footings was in the case of a winery that was using the solar. They were putting the solar over their parking area, and they were using the solar panels. They were lifting them up so that they would also serve the purpose of a carport. But what happened was when they lifted them up that high and they were so big, they were creating a parachute, really. And so their engineer said, we need concrete footings to keep these down. And that was deemed acceptable for the situation that they were in. I already mentioned not serving an off-farm use or non-ag use on an exception area. So that I had just talked about, not providing power to outside of your farm. And then this last one is kind of the gist of the whole rule. So the systems, like I said, they're not meant to be the grid scale 25 acres sending power back to the grid for the general use of the community. These are on-farm systems, and so they are limited to either 110% of last year's energy demand or up to 1% of the land area of your farm. So if you've got a 100-acre farm, you could put 1 acre in panels. And in that case, if you do the 1%, you would be allowed to send the power back to the grid. But so far, there's two things. For the 1%, folks have said if I was going to send it back to the grid, the system would have to be much larger and acres and acres for that to be cost effective. So that hasn't happened. Where people have used 1% is if they know that they have a demand coming up, like they are a fruit or vegetable farm and they're about to install a very large cooling system that's going to be brand new for their farm. But as part of the process, they're going solar and they want to just kind of predict what that energy demand is going to be. We have 1 or 2 folks who have used the 1% rule that way. But most of the time, it's the 110%. And I will say most of the time, they are less than 100%. I don't know if, I believe that there's tax incentive, or at least there was tax incentive if you did not go over 100%. So a vast majority of the systems that we've seen are in that 90 to 99% range. People haven't wanted to trigger going over 100. I don't know if that's a New Jersey thing or if it's a federal thing, tax incentive wise, but it definitely seems to be a net positive for the landowner to not go over 100% in a lot of cases. So that's it for that slide. I'm just trying to follow along. Yep, I think that might have been my last slide. I think so. I think we turn it over to Justin.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As Laura said, my name is Justin Bryan. I'm the program manager for EnSave. Excuse me. And just a little bit about what we do at EnSave. We partner with the North Jersey RC&D as part of the Rural Energy Development Assistance Program, or REDA program. So our role is geared towards a lot of what Chuck has talked about. So there's a lot of regulations. There's a lot of issues. We could call it, rules, things that you would need to be aware of. And part of our role in helping partnering with North Jersey RC&D is to develop a system that meets these requirements. So our job is to generate a technical report for you, the farm, as part of this REDA program with the North Jersey RC&D that specs out a system that will meet all of these requirements. So, for instance, no more than 110% of historical use, the proper setbacks and screenings and those kind of things. That's what our job is. And what you'll be able to do is take that technical report and you can provide, give that to your solar provider, or even apply for additional grants through rural development, such as the REAP, the Rural Energy Assistance Program, where you can get a 40% incentive or cost share, ever how you want to look at it, all the way up to 50% in some cases, cost share for your system. So we take a lot of the guesswork out of it by developing, a system analysis and report for you. So on those lines, I'm going to talk about some setbacks and screenings and some common issues that we see. So right here you can see the agricultural management practices setbacks, and it says requirements, and I just want to echo what Chuck said. These are not, they're written into the statute, so they are required in the statute, but again, this is more of as Chuck said, a good neighbor practice. So if you do want to go this route and then go ahead and install your system according to these AMP, agricultural management practices, this would be what you would want to consider. So there's setback requirements for ground-mounted systems, and those do vary. So the two that you want to concern yourself with is the distance to adjacent residences that are not on your farm. So, if you want it 5 foot behind, your house, that might not be a problem, but there are setback requirements to adjacent residences that are not part of the farm, as well as setback requirements for property lines and public road right-of-ways. And again, just to define setback, it's the distance from the nearest vertical component within the occupied area. That's including the solar arrays, inverters, and fencing. So I have seen some of these, designs and farmers decide they want to fence around it. So if you have, like Chuck said, if you have an acre of solar panels and you put a fence around that acre, 20 feet away, the setback will start from that fence post 20 feet from your solar array. So that's something to kind of keep in mind with that. Next slide, please, Laura. Okay, so there's also screening requirements. These screening requirements are specifically referring to exactly what it sounds like, a vegetative or hedgerow screen that is going to cover a portion of the solar array. And it's going to minimize, the goal is to minimize views from public roadways and existing residences. And there are some required screenings with these agricultural management practices. So if a system has a height up to 10 feet and occupies an area of 1 to 10 acres, so again, a large area, then a screening is required for that. And then also a system with a height between 10 and 20 feet and occupying area up to 10 acres. So again, if it's higher than 10, between 10 and 20 feet, screening is required as part of these ag management practices. The screening should cover 75% of the project, and it would be visual barriers. So buildings, trees, hedgerows, and pre-existing natural topography. So again, if you put it behind your barn and the only thing anybody can see from the road is your barn, then that's screening. So you can use existing measures to screen that system. Tree lines between the road, the right-of-way, and your system counts. If your farm is downhill from a road and and a hill can cover up portion of that, and you want to put it down in that bottom, that's a good way to use the topography as well to meet that 75% screening requirement. Next slide, please. All right, so here's an example, just a little simple map and of what this would look like. So the white box, it would represent your ground-mounted solar system. So if you look over to the far right, that would be the east side of this map by the road. You've got a tree line between the road and your and the PV array. So you've got actually two sets of trees. There's a tree line by the road and a group of trees in there, and it's also 535 feet from the road. And that's again discussing the setbacks depending on the size and everything. As if I remember correctly in the statute, it's generally like between 300 and 400 feet, depending on the size of the system from a road right of way or road. And then also, if you look at the far south end, that would be considered an adjacent residence off farm. Not part of the farm property, and again, that's 500 feet from that residence. And if I remember correctly, it's somewhere in that 200 to 400 foot range from adjacent residences as well. And again, as you can see right there in the middle, there is another tree line. So the screening is taken care of by your tree lines in between the road and the adjacent property, and you can see that the setbacks are also fine, over 500 feet, which would meet the requirements of the setbacks there. So that's just an example of what that would look like. All right, so for some common issues for the preserved farms. So as Chuck was talking about, there's several ways to get solar. They want to sell it to you, and so there's several ways you can own it outright. In other words, just stroke them a check on day one. You can lease it, and then there's also a power purchase agreement that you can get into. The problem for the preserved farms is with these ag management practices is that, again, you've got to own it after 20 years. So leases longer than 20 years won't work. So definitely, when we're looking at these things, you want to, look into, okay, well, how long are they wanting me to lease this for? Typically, solar vendors will sell you a system with a useful life of 25 years. And so, just got to make sure as you're looking at that, if you're going to lease it with them, if they want to lease it for the useful life, well, they're talking about 25 years in most cases. Whereas, this program, you need to own it after, starting at 20 years. 20-year lease, option to extend. Again, as Chuck was mentioning, you need to own this system. The landowner should own this system starting in year 20. There's also removal clauses. So if you have a power purchase agreement, the solar vendor will actually, own the system. And what they'll do is at the end of that 20 years or 25 years, whatever that useful life they've deemed of it, they'll have a clause in the contract with you to come and remove that. So part of that, power purchase agreement, it works out well for a lot of folks because they don't necessarily own the system. They're just allowing a third party to install a system on their farm and purchase power from that solar vendor or installer, usually at a much cheaper rate than the power company. And they can get power from the power company. The problem is, again, these removal clauses, it needs to stay there and you're going to have to own it after that 20 years. And then again, as Chuck was saying, no ability for transfer of ownership. So if you're leasing it, there needs to be essentially it needs to be a lease to buy. And where at year 20, the settlement is paid and you own that system. There's just several things to keep in mind if you're going through, if you're looking at a lease option or a power purchase agreement, just to kind of keep your eyes out for when looking for that. And I will note that as part of this RETA program with North Jersey, excuse me, I want to make sure everyone is aware that part of this program is you'll be able to take our technical report for your system and use it to apply for a REAP grant, which again would be up to 50% of the installed cost of that system. Right now, it's 40%, but they're looking at increasing that percentage to 50 over the next year or so. So that would help offset, at least some of that cost. It may not get you to the point, where you can stroke that check on day one, but at least that might get your lease term down and be able to own that system inside of that 20 years. So, all right, next slide. All right, so good deal. So we'll talk about the request, the system size and type. So again, what we're developing as part of this RETA is a system whose size is not over 110% of your previous calendar year's annual, energy demand. If you just go straight to a solar vendor, it just depends, what they're looking at and, what kind of system they're wanting to sell you. But that system design may be over 110%. So, yet again, another thing to keep in mind, your system should not be over 110% of your previous calendar year's use. Another thing that we do, and Chuck mentioned, sometimes it's hard to get a hold of some paperwork. One of the things that we've been able to do, partnering with North Jersey, is to work on your behalf and get in touch with the power company to get that the utility information that we need. And so if that is a problem, we have been able to to reach out on the farmer's behalf and get those the information that we need to help design the system. And once we have that, of course, you'll get a copy of that as well. And so for your application, as Chuck was saying, you'll need those anyway. And so that is one way that we've been able to help out as well, is kind of stepping up to the plate for the farmer, so to speak. So also the townships, your townships permits are approved without consideration of the preservation easement. So all of the things that we've been talking about, the setbacks, the screenings, the system size over 110%, all of these things, your township is going to approve it as if it's a building project. So in other words, if the township issues a building permit for a system whose size is 200%, they don't care. In other words, they're not going to look at the preservation farm status and the statute and say, oh, well, we can't issue that permit because it's too big. So just keep in mind as you're talking with, your townships, your local, authorities, so to speak, about these, just make sure that they understand, where you're at, and really it's going to fall in your lap to ensure that, that system is going to be, properly sized and meet these agricultural management practices if that's the route you're wanting to go. And then finally, the community solar, and Chuck already touched on that, but this system cannot provide power to something that is not farm use. So again, the welding business that's renting your shed or whatever that may be, it can only provide heating and energy offset for the farm. So it just can't power your brother-in-law's house or something like that next door. It would have to be just for the farm use. And again, sometimes wires get crossed, and some of these proposals, the solar vendors, again, wires get crossed, and we get some issues with that where we see some requests or things like that. But again, for this agricultural management practices, it would need to just power your farm and farm related heating and energy offset. So, all right, next slide, Laura. Thank you. Yeah, just a resources page. This is a great place to get started. Of course, our contact information will be on the next slide, and you are, please, anybody feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions. But just a few resources. I do want to highlight the very last resource right there. NREL's Agrivoltaic, NREL's Agrivoltaics research. We're going to actually have a webinar on this. Laura, I believe it's March 4th. Is that correct?
Yes, the next one will be, I'm just copying and pasting some of the resources into the chat. I'll let you know on the next. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not going to touch heavily on it today because we are having a webinar on this, but coming from a farming background, farmland is precious. You know, that it's not something that you want to lose, and it's not something that you really, you know, if you can help from taking it out of production, especially if it's very productive land, you would, you know, farmers, you know, would rather not do that. It's a very precious commodity. The soil is what, you know, makes your living. And so if we can avoid, you know, putting down a solar panel system and taking your land out of production, that would be the way to go. And agrivoltaics is a fairly new concept, but it is becoming extremely popular. So agrivoltaics is essentially just a name for a raised or a pole-mounted PV system. And what this would do, the spacing would be a little bit different, but what it would allow for is, you know, about 10 or 12 feet, and it really depends on your equipment and what you've got, what you're using, what the purpose of it would be for. If you just want to graze sheep under it, for instance, you know, we can put that, you know, you can raise it up, you know, 5 or 6 feet, you know, something like that, and they, you know, you plant some native grasses or, you know, something like that under it, and your sheep can graze. If you want to be able to, you know, produce vegetables under that, and you need to get a tractor underneath, you know, it might be better to raise it up 10 or 12 feet. But essentially, it's a pole-mounted PV system spaced out so that sun and water can infiltrate. And you can see on the slide that we have now kind of an example of what that might look like. But there's several resources and white papers that are actually showing, you know, increased yields and you know, a lot of benefits to this. And the main one being that it doesn't take your land out of production. You can still graze, you can still farm under it, you know, while meeting all of these requirements that we've talked about. So again, I won't dive too deeply into it because we are going to have a webinar on it. But I do want to highlight that that is a video. If anybody wants to go and check that out, but we'll talk about that at the next webinar. So
thank you, Justin. And I've gone forward and I'm sharing the contact information now for more information. And I see in the chat, Margaret had asked if the slides will be available, and they will be, Margaret. I can email them out directly to you, but then we'll also be posting them on our website. Going forward, you're right, Justin, there is a lunch and learn. The next one is going to be on March 3rd, actually at noon on the agrivoltaic. And then our final will be on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And that will be on understanding REAP and other funding. And so how to really assist the solar project. We are over on our time, but I want to allow, are there any questions that anyone would like answered at this point in time?